Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the series where I'm recreating Murray's costume manor from Secret of the Mimic in Minecraft. In the last video, we took a look at all three of the showrooms, but today we're going to be moving down to the basement and building Nurse Dollie's hospital. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to subscribe to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the rest of the series and can help the channel reach 200,000 subscribers before the end of the year. It's completely free and helps out a whole lot more than you know. But with that now out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. Before I begin on the build itself, I want to quickly go over the outlines for all of this. As you all know by now, I always like to outline my builds before I get started, that way I know where everything should be and I can just get straight into building. However, the outlines for this has absolutely become one of the messiest things I've ever had to prepare, with the only thing that comes close to it being the utility tunnels from Security Breach. But I think that this place easily takes the cake for the most confusing, as not only is it spread out across a much wider area, but it's also made up of two separate floors, where it spans across almost the entirety of the costume manor with lots of smaller rooms scattered around the place. Already you can see how with the outlines I've had to place multiple different colors of blocks next to each other, where each color represents a different prop that is going to be there eventually. And in some cases, they just take up entire walkways and rooms, as there is just so much going on within such a small area. I also had to be careful with the size and shapes of each one of the rooms, as not only is this entire build connected directly to the costume manor, but it also connects to itself in different ways at completely different points of the build. There's also a second hallway that leads to another elevator, which then leads back up to the first floor again, which then directly connects back to the first floor of the build. This is why I can't stress enough that outlining a build before getting started on it is extremely helpful, and it just helps solve the headache of needing to reposition entire builds while you're already halfway through completing it. By doing all of this before I actually get started building, I already know that everything is in its proper place, and if I need to move an entire building, I only need to change a few outlines instead of half of a completed build. Either way though, with all of the pre-planning preparations now out of the way with, I can now get started working on the build itself and start filling up all of these outlines. I'm not sure how to describe this other than the nurse hospital had a certain vibe to it that I really liked while playing through the game. I've talked about how I really enjoyed the workshop section and how that's my favorite part of Secret of the Mimic, but this part is also up there as well, and I think this overshadows the workshop despite the fact that both areas are actually very similar. They both have a stealth section where you have to sneak around an area and collect objects and deliver them to a certain area. However, I think the main difference with this part is that though the environment is a lot more colorful, it has a main named character to it. In the workshop, it's just a bunch of mascot suits that we see all over the costume manor, but here we have Nurse Dollie, and I think that stands out a lot more because you have a specific different character to deal with. On top of that, there is also a chase sequence at the end of this chapter, which I think complements it very well, but if you really think about it, both of those sections are very similar to each other, so it does really make sense as to why I liked this section just as much as the workshop. With that being said though, this area is definitely much smaller than the workshop. That build spanned two floors against each other, while this one does have multiple floors, but they're separated in a way where they're basically two completely different builds, despite the fact I'm going to keep referring to it as floor 1 and floor 2. But actually taking a look at the build itself, this area had something that I was actually really looking forward to getting around to, which is something I bet none of you would expect me to say, and that's to use copper blocks. I don't get to use these very often, but the times I do, the build always ends up looking really nice. The only examples I can think of are my FNAF 3 build that I built back in 2023, Jeff's Pizza from Into the Pit, and now this. All three of those builds had a weird homely feel to them whenever I use them, and it's really a shame because these are very specific blocks that only work in certain areas. For here it works well because it's a sickly green which fits the theme of a doll hospital, but it just has a nice feeling to it, which again is really weird considering this is a hospital in the basement of a factory with a murderous endoskeleton roaming the halls. It's a very niche block, but it also doesn't stand out too much where it takes away from the look of the build. This isn't an attraction after all, and it's not something that many people are going to be visiting, so it's not going to have the iconic orange and yellow stripes that go around some of the lobbies in the main factory, but it still has a nice color to it that makes it stand out and isn't just a bland and boring white and grey walls around the entire place. It actually has a character to it, which helps it stand out against all the other storage facilities inside this giant factory. But on the topic of this place having some of those storage shelves, I actually want to bring up something I haven't done yet, which is how I actually go about building the shelves themselves, which sounds really weird, but you'll see what I mean once I actually get into it. Sometimes you will see me actually build the shelf itself by using inverted staircases, so that way it actually looks like the multiple layers on a shelf, and here you'll see me use blocks that actually make up the objects that are stored on the shelves themselves instead of those actual shelving units. And the reason why I mix them up is because sometimes I decide that one object is more important than the other, but it also takes away one of those at the same time. I can't have the shelf without the actual storage object itself, but I can't have the object without the shelf because otherwise it looks like it's all just stacked up on the wall. What I think I'll do eventually is possibly remove all of these blocks and maybe replace them with armor stand models as well, which is an idea I've talked a lot about throughout the series, but I think that not just limiting it to actual mascot costumes, but also the decorations around the build itself is going to help add in a lot more detail, so that way it can actually show off what the object is supposed to be. As always, I just enjoy spitballing these random ideas I have about this project, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are about it in the comments. Surprisingly, it took quite a while to actually get this part of the build completed, despite the fact that this is only the first half of it, and that this is really just a compilation of smaller storage rooms connecting to each other. There is still lots going on, and you can see my building style has to change multiple times throughout this floor. However, I think that all of the blocks have worked together really well to make this build look just as good. But even though most of what I've built so far only shows up at the end of the segment, I've had to build it in this order because this directly connects back up to the main build of the MCM again, where it then leads to the staircase, which brings us up to the storage room where the security office is. In fact, the Dollie warehouse is the only basement that has a direct connection to the main factory, as all of the other basements have fake elevators that teleport the player somewhere completely different. However, that is a topic we'll take a look at later on, and trust me, I have a lot of things that I can say about that. Moving on to the main focus of this segment though, this is the room where Nurse Dollie slides along the rails while we try to access this door to move on to the actual hospital itself. Now, the thing is with all of this is that you've noticed that these walkways are 2 blocks wide, despite the fact that the staircase is the only block that Dollie would be standing on. But all of this is designed around these doors here because I really wanted to make sure I was able to capture the detail of these doors, where not only is it a bit bigger than the player is, but it also has the 2 shock handles that would let only a Dollie animatronic access them and move on to the next area. But if you remember what the outlines looked like, you can see just how claustrophobic and messy this room is, and I wasn't joking about each of those blocks representing a certain object, where it is very important for me to distinguish which block is what color, as otherwise it would be impossible for me to figure out what is going to go where. But let's actually look at the exciting stuff, which is the doll hospital itself, which is much smaller in scale compared to what we just looked at. However, it still has just as much, if not even more going on, as it's not just limiting props to the floor and the walls anymore, as there's also chains and other mascot suit parts hanging along the ceiling. Of course, the thing that stands out the most in this room is the giant grate along the floor, which lets you look down to the conveyor belt beneath it, which is then going to lead along to the actual furnace with all of these molten lava blocks. However, even though there's no gameplay added for the time being, I've still added in all of those gameplay elements themselves, such as the giant trash chutes that would have all of those trash cubes in them, as well as the containers that you put them in that then lead down to the conveyor belt beneath them. But as I keep bringing up, the rest of this doll hospital is really just made up of long and narrow hallways where it's difficult to tell where you are, especially if it's your first time playing the game. However, each part does lead to another area, like with this vent system here, so you're not just trapped if you go one way, and there are multiple ways of getting from one side of the building all the way down to the other. Moving on to the other side of the doll hospital though, past the main trash chute, is where all of those storage shelves are going to show up that I talked about during the time lapse. Instead of actually making the shelf itself by using these stone blocks, what I've done is use different types of blocks to represent the mascot suits themselves, while also making it not look like one giant mess. Now this still doesn't exactly look the prettiest, but then again, a giant compilation of different mascot suits isn't really going to, but what I've done here is used 3 different types of blocks for the base of it, and then added birch signs on top of them, so that way it adds a little bit more depth to the actual decoration itself. The opposite to this would be these orange shelves here, where there is still decorations inside of them, however I'm obviously not able to put anything within this small slab of space right here. I can only put things on top of the block or beneath it. So this is where you can also see me using a mix of the two, where I've added in those 4 blocks underneath the shelf, but then at the top of it I've added in those stone blocks as well as some extra slabs on top of it to represent some of those smaller decorations. But this room isn't just for storage and actually has a function to it through this vent access here, which is then going to lead us to a larger vent space, which then brings us through a second vent, which is eventually going to lead us to the main control room. Now this is where the build changes completely in design, as it no longer has those nicer blocks to look at and is instead lots of grey, lots of concrete along the floors, and has a more industrial look to it, which is complemented by all of the pipes going along the walls and the ceiling. However, since we obviously don't want to jump inside a pit of molten metal, the way to actually get down to the conveyor room is behind another doorway inside of the main hospital, where this doorway is then going to lead down to the lower levels, eventually bringing us to the conveyor room itself. From here we would then be able to pull all of the levers to dispense all of the trash, which is then going to move along this conveyor belt that eventually leads to the pit in the center of this room here. And despite all of these cool ways that the build connects to itself, this part right here is the vent that Dollie jumps through to get inside the conveyor room to chase after us, and would you believe it, this vent doesn't actually connect to another vent. She actually jumps through the floor inside this little airlock, where then she appears out of the vent just because the game needs her to. It's just a silly thing like that I think is worth bringing up, as I always like to go over the cool hidden hallways throughout buildings, and then the game just decides to get rid of all of that by adding imaginary access points that shouldn't actually exist. With that being said though, let's actually take a look at what I'm going to be building next, which is behind these set of double doors right here, which is then going to lead us down to the lower levels of the doll hospital, where we actually get to see the recycling plant of the factory itself. Now this once again spans across the same amount of space, however you can see the difference in size between the two, where this is a lot of separate smaller rooms within a smaller space. However, this is really just 3 giant rooms, with them being much smaller and much grander in scale. So not only is all of this going to change my building style because now I have more space to work with, but because this area is a lot more industrial than what we've just gone over, it's also going to change my block palette, so it's going to be interesting to see how I'm going to have to work different blocks to work in a completely different way. But with all of that being said, there is a lot more building ahead of me, so I say we don't waste any more time and get right back into building. This is what I like to call the random rooms of nothing, or the big open rooms that have nothing going on in them. And Secret of the Mimic actually has quite a few of them, but this is the first one that I've actually managed to get around to building so far. And what I mean by big room with nothing in it isn't that there's literally nothing in it. In fact, that's completely the opposite from what's actually shown here. The decorations around this place are really cool, especially with all of the hanging buckets full of molten metal. But what I mean by nothing rooms is we're here for like 2 minutes and there's nothing to do. There is no gameplay in these rooms. It is just a big room to get you from point A to point B with a bunch of filler things to make it look somewhat interesting. And it does a good job. These rooms are some of my favorite within this entire chapter of the game. But there is literally nothing to do here. They are just big rooms for the sake of being big rooms. The other one that I can think of off the top of my head right now is just before the Jackie chase down in that basement corridor where you go up the elevator. It's a big room with lots of catwalks and pipes going everywhere, but there's nothing in the room. There is no doorway that leads anywhere. There's nothing going on, which is what I'm getting at. But that is kind of important to this as well, because as I was building this room specifically, It was a mess, and I'm not talking about the blocks, I'm talking about figuring out where I actually wanted to continue building, and you're going to see this throughout this time-lapse specifically as well, because there is so much going on in so many parts of the build, where it's really difficult for me to just not flip from one side of the build all the way to the other, and somehow find a way to continue from one side of the build to another in somewhat of an order. So with this camera, you're going to see me go back and forth multiple times, going up and down different alleyways or walkways, just so I can fill in the space. There is a lot going on still, even in these big areas, and trying to fill it up in somewhat of an order where I'm actually getting things done in a consistent way is surprisingly difficult. It reminds me a lot of building the Pizzaplex again, but even then, those rooms weren't as filled up as these ones were, because with the Pizzaplex, either the bigger rooms purposely had nothing going on in them, or the smaller rooms were just as filled up as these rooms are. And what better way to fill up a room than with pointless and random pipes? Steel will really like their pipes in this build. There are so many of them, and that gets really difficult when they all look the same, because then what I have to do is make sure that they actually stand out as being their own separate object, while still making sure I add in all of them and don't take up half the build, because there is still supposed to be some open space for you to be able to see the ceiling, but all of the pipes just scatter around the entire build and make it look much more messy than it actually is. And all of this, by the way, and we are only in this entire segment for maybe 5 minutes tops. Like, there is so much going on, so much detail in such a really cool environment. This chase sequence does not last long. In fact, it might be the quickest chase sequence, which is a shame because this environment is probably the coolest of the chase sequences, I think, in my opinion right now, as I'm just thinking about it on the top of my head, and the music to go along with it. I have to play it right now during this time lapse because I just think the music in this game is so good. But it is a shame that we're only here for a short amount of time and don't really get to look at it because we're being chased, you know? The focus when there's something after you isn't, oh, let me look at this cool decoration because this place looks sick. No, you're focused on the giant killer robot that's chasing you down these narrow hallways, which, you know, the point of the game isn't to go around the build. That's really just a niche on my end where I'm the nerd when it comes to looking at all the cool details in a FNAF location, but it is something I enjoy. Like, genuinely, I don't just play the FNAF games to do that. Obviously, I play the FNAF games to play the game itself, but once I'm done playing through it, I do love going back through it all and seeing all the details that you would miss normally. It's something I've enjoyed doing for years now, and I see myself doing it in the future even without FNAF games. You know, I really want to get around to making non-FNAF games later this year, and I think it will once again reignite that really cool feeling. And that now wraps everything up to do with the doll hospital, where I quickly wanted to take a look at it from the outside just to see the sheer scale of it compared to the main MCM facility. Now obviously the entire layout of the main floors is going to spread out much more than the basements do, however you can see how tall, or I guess how deep, these floors are compared to the main build, where if I were to put these on the same Y level, it would probably tower the main part of the facility. This definitely adds a lot of depth to the build, even if it's going to be all below ground underneath the main build itself. But let's start inside this entry room right here where we take the elevator down, which then leads us to the room where the chase sequence actually starts. And though I keep calling this room a big empty room full of nothing, there is actually a lot of cool stuff going on here. In fact, this might actually be my favorite room in the doll hospital, not just because of the grand scale of it all, but the industrial decorations that go along in here is almost borderline sci-fi, because this is just over the top. This is way too excessive for a factory, where I know this is supposed to be a recycling center, but this is borderline of something you would see in the chop shop from the film Robots. I don't know if any of you have actually know what I'm talking about there, but if you've seen the movie Robots, you should remember what the chop shop is. This reminds me a lot of that, and that's not a bad thing. That's really good actually, because that was such a unique environment, and I think that this game has some of those areas, especially within this basement. But like I mentioned before I got started, this build absolutely had to make me change the way I went about building it, as not only is the size much bigger than anything else, but also the blocks are completely different from the rest of the build, and I really want to start by talking about these green bricks right here. Obviously there's no green bricks in Minecraft other than I guess dark prismarine, but that block doesn't really work well with the rest of the green blocks. So what I decided to do instead was take 3 random green blocks, work them together so that way I could get the texturing detail, while also mixing in some darker green blocks so that way it actually kind of gives off a brick-like texture to it. But now let's take a look at the second room, which is immediately after Dollie pops out of the vat and then starts chasing us throughout these conveyor rooms. And though it looks very tight, narrow, and compact around the place, it really is the pipes that make it feel very claustrophobic, as the room itself is honestly the complete opposite. It is very wide and very open, but it's all of those secondary details that make everything feel so tight and compact. There's of course the 2 main conveyor belts on either side of the room, which obviously don't work right now, but you can see all of the other secondary details that make up the main room itself, across all of the walls and the ceiling. There's plenty of pipes, there's plenty of support beams, there's even a catwalk that goes across the ceiling, which leads absolutely nowhere. It is just a set piece, it's not actually meant to have any function, it's just meant to fill up the room so that way it isn't just an empty room full of nothing. And I honestly don't really know where to go from here. There is just so much in so many spaces which are all not separated from each other, but there's lots of objects in the way that cover up different places where it's difficult for me to go in somewhat of an order. It was the same thing that when I was building, I was trying to figure out where I wanted to go to next, and I'm kind of in the same situation just trying to go around the place. There's so much to look at. But we'll go over to the exit place later on. I guess we can move on to the third room right now. There's once again lots of expected pipes and other scaffolding pieces to hold up the supports for the room itself. There's more catwalks that go around the room, which I'm gonna go on a little bit of a tangent quickly. Kind of disappoints me. Like, I can understand having these for set pieces, but when you throw a door like this just to tease me, like there could be a completely different room behind this that could then lead to a completely separate section of this build. I want to know what's behind this door, but unfortunately we're never probably going to figure that out, so it's just up to imagination to imagine. We haven't even seen the entirety of the MCM. Despite everything we may know, there's still so much to it that we will never get to see. But I suppose what I am able to do is actually recreate the path that we take during the chase sequence, which will also help me figure out where I need to get to next. So this is where Dollie would burst out of the wall and then start running towards us. So we take this vent to our right and then crawl through this vent system. That way we get to the next area once the chase sequence ends and returns to once again another stealth section, where instead of running away, we need to crawl around the place underneath different chains. That way we avoid the detection of Dollie. This area once again acts as another transition piece between the 2 basements, as once again I'm starting to use the copper blocks again to resemble the doll warehouse up above. Now, it was actually really cool getting to build some of these segments, as we're not actually able to get inside some of these rooms, as Dollie would just immediately detect us and start chasing after us. So even though we're not able to go there in game, it's still really cool to walk through it all in a Minecraft form, where now I'm able to experience the full build completely. But the final part of the build is of course the elevator that brings us up to the first floor again, which actually has a few things going on with it. Because the top of the elevator isn't covered up by a ceiling, I did actually need to recreate the entire elevator shaft itself, which not only comes with all of the wires and cables that would drag an elevator up and down, but also all of the other intricate pieces like different floors, as well as the control panels that open up to let us fix the elevator. Now, something about the elevator shaft that I want to bring up is about the actual height of it, as this can only span across 4 floors, which is much more realistic than what we see in game. Because it goes through an entire gameplay sequence where we need to complete different tasks as the elevator is moving, the model seen in game spans over hundreds upon hundreds of different floors. This is of course completely unrealistic to the actual layout of the building. However, since I am recreating this build to be all connected to itself and not focusing on the gameplay right now, obviously this is only how tall it's going to be, unlike how it's seen in game. It does make sense for the developers to do that, but I still thought it was a fun fact worth bringing up. And before I forget, there's one more thing that I want to bring up, which goes back to what I was saying earlier about how the doll hospital is the only basement that directly connects to the MCM, as the rest of the basements use teleporting elevators to get from one side to the other. And this is important because there are parts of the build where you are able to see other parts of the factory from other parts. Something we talked about last episode was how the theater room directly connects to the storytime showroom through this hole here, and this directly connects down to the moon where it fell down across all 3 floors. However, as you might have guessed, the Dollie Hospital is kind of taking up the space where the moon should be, so that's going to be something I get to figure out in the next episode. It's going to be very interesting because, I mean, both builds are kind of overlapping. Not sure what they were thinking about that one, but that's kind of annoying, and I'm going to have to figure out how I'm going to work my way around that. That should be fun. It might seem like I've constantly been nitpicking and complaining about the layout of this basement, but honestly, this is still part of the fun of it. Not only do I find the game development side of things to be really interesting, but also trying to translate it inside a completely different media is just such a really fun challenge, and it will always be unique every single time because not one game works in the same way anytime. There are some areas later on which make absolutely no sense in the overall layout of the MCM, but that is once again going to be part of the challenge and is going to make me have to work in different ways, so that way I'm able to recreate this entire game as closely as possible. But going back to the Dollie Hospital itself, it was a very nice balance between being a fun build, but also being challenging in its own unique way. I already talked about the block choice, I already talked about the scale of it, and of course I've gone over many times about how it connects to the main part of the building. And even though there's a bunch of areas that only show up for a few minutes in game, because I'm building this in a Minecraft form, I'm able to experience it and take it all in a much better way, since now I'm able to do whatever I want and can take my time going between all of the different areas. This of course applies to anything that you recreate, whether it be a painting, a model, or a Minecraft build, and it doesn't even need to apply to one thing specifically. Anytime you recreate something, you're able to express it in a different way, and because you're the one making it, you're just going to feel even more satisfied with the finished result. There's still a few more areas left for me to add before this build has been completed, and I'm sure we'll see me coming across some of those challenges as I go along. So make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with all notifications turned on, so that way you don't miss out on the rest of the series and can also help the channel reach 200,000 subscribers before the end of the year. But with that being said, thank you everyone so much for watching, and I will of course see you in my next video.